Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to Wix-Wiz. Today we are going to be developing a custom tipping or donation widget like the one you see here using the Wix-Pay API. If you haven't seen my previous video, which gives a very basic introduction to the API, I recommend checking it out first. But if you're familiar with the API and you want to build something like this, where somebody can either select a tip amount or enter a custom amount and go ahead and click Tip Now to open up the payments modal, then you're in the right place, and let's get started. So for this demonstration, I've set up a simple tipping widget or donation widget where basically we take some basic information from the person and then they can either select an amount that they want to tip or enter a custom amount. Regarding currencies, we're going to deal with that in a later tutorial, and then they can just click tip now, and depending on the success of their tip, then they will either see a success message or an error message. So this is a very simple tipping widget, and now we're going to go ahead and program this together using the Wix-Pay API. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to program these small tip buttons, and here I'm going to be demonstrating a realistic situation where the information about the quote-unquote product is stored in a collection. So I've built a database with our tip rates, and you can see here, if I open the collection, that I've created 3 different tips. One is a small tip, one is a medium tip, and one is a large tip, and I set the prices over here. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this price to 6. And I'm going to show you how on both the front end and on the back end, we are going to both display the prices and calculate the prices using the information in this collection. And that way keeping our transaction a lot more secure and flexible. So let's start with the front end. So you'll see here that already I have some code written out from the first tutorial, which explained the basics about Wix-Pay. And what we're going to be doing here first is we are going to be getting the data from our collection and using it to populate the buttons. So at the moment, you can see that the numbers here are determined just by whatever I put as the change text and icon here, but I want to set this using the collection so that if I ever want to change the tip amounts, I don't have to go to all my buttons and change them, but rather I can just change them in my collection. In order to do that, I'm going to head over to our front end code. And first of all, I'm going to import English. I will import Wix data. From the Wix data module, so we can do all of our data querying. And then over here, I'm going to set up a function. I'm going to call it set tip amounts. And this is going to be an async function that will basically query our data set. So I'm going to call this, what did we call it? Tip rates query result. This is going to be equal to await Wix data query. And we're going to be querying tip rates. Make this disappear for a second, and then we are going to find, because we want to get all the rates for the page. And then I'm going to say const rates equals to tip rates query result dot items. I'm not setting in a condition here that if items is larger than 0, because I know it will be in any situation that we're doing this correctly. And just fix up here, this is a spelling mistake, and here I'm going to change this amounts to rates, just so that we have some consistency here in the language. Now that we have those rates, I am going to run through them and set each of these button values using those rates. So you can see here that the buttons are named small, medium, and large, which is similar to the titles of our tip rates. So I'm going to say tip rate query result dot for each, and we'll say here rate in the callback function as a parameter. And then we're going to do a few things. So we're going to say that the button, here we're going to use a template literal, and here I'm going to say title and tip button. So the title here should be either small, medium, or large, like we set it up in the collection. And that dot label, so that's how you set the inner text of the button, will be equal to $sign plus rate dot, what did I call it? I think price. Let me double check. So I have here tip rates and price. Okay, so I'm going to set that over there. Dot price. And the last thing that I want to do is I actually want to hoist these rates up. Do I want to hoist these rates? I don't think I need to hoist these rates. Changed my mind. Not hoisting the rates. And let's go ahead and publish this. And I'm just going to take a look at it on the live site. And that did not work because this should be 6 based on that. So let's go ahead and check console here. Is not a function. Okay, let me take a look. I think I forgot to call the function. So let's go over here and set tip rates. Set tip rates. Okay, why did it tell me? And let's add a console here. Log rates. Now let's do this in preview mode. I'm not going to publish the site again. Hopefully this will save us some time. And tip rates query result dot for each. Oh, duh. Okay, so these are our rates, but this should be rates. Okay, so you got a free debugging lesson along with this tutorial. And let's check out what it looks like now. Title is not defined. This needs to be rate.title. Preview. And now our button is showing 6. Okay, so now these values are all being taken from the collection. So if I would go and change the small tip, this would be whatever the small tip was. You can see the medium tip changed, and the same for the large tip. Now what we need to do is do something very similar on the back end. So I'm going to go back to the editor, and I am going to copy over just these 2 lines, because we're going to be using that in the back end as well. I'm going to head to the Wix-Pay backend, and I'm going to import. Again, this is code that we set up during the first part of this tutorial. So if you haven't seen that video yet and you're not so clear on what this all is, you might want to check it out. But I'm going to be importing Wix data here as well. And instead of these items that I have over here, I'm going to get rid of this item. And when we do create my payment, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to get those rates. Okay, because these rates are essentially, I'm just going to change this to an asynchronous function. Essentially, these rates are the items that they're paying for. Okay, so now I need to take these rates and I need to somehow translate that into the item that's being paid for. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to pass some information from the back end to the from the front end, sorry, to the back end to indicate which of these three rates the person is going to be paying for. So I'm going to add a parameter here, which is going to be rate, and I'm going to add on the front end, inside of the create my payment function, I'm going to add a rate parameter as well. And now let's think about how we're going to set this rate parameter. So we're going to set it by clicking on one of these buttons. So here I'm going to go ahead and set up the onClick event for each button. So let me copy this over. And I'm going to say .onClick. And here what we want to do is we are going to want to have a global variable. So we're going to say let rate. And we're going to set this rate based on what is selected. Okay, so when we click, we're going to say rate equals rate dot title. And again, I'm not passing in the amount that they're going to be paying. I'm just passing in the name of that rate. Okay, and then when we start the payment, that rate will be passed in. What I also want to do when we click on a button is something that has to do a little bit with the user experience. When we click on a certain button, I'm going to enable all the other buttons and disable the button that was clicked so that it's very visible which button has been clicked. So I'm going to say, first let's deal with enabling this button. So I'm going to go over here and enable. And for disabling all the other buttons, disable. Right, we're disabling the button that was clicked. And before that, we're going to need to enable all the buttons, because if we do it afterwards, then this will be enabled as well. And I'm going to do it the same way that we did this. So I'm going to add here rates dot for each. And here I'm going to have rate. And I'm going to use this same selector and say dot enable. We're kind of using a for loop in a for loop here, but it's not really a performance issue because this for loop runs when our code first runs in the beginning, and this for loop will only run when a button is clicked. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue. And now in the back end, we are going to be getting our rate here in the create payment. And what we're going to do is filter all our rates by this rate property. So I'm going to say const selected rate will be equal to rates dot filter. And we're going to be filtering it so that the rate dot title will be equal to the rate. Again, this will just be a text, a string. And now that we've filtered that, what we're going to want to do is we are going to want to map this so that it is usable here in this items parameter here for the create payment. Okay, because you'll see that this items is structured in a very specific way. So we have name, price, quantity. So we need it to be structured similarly because now we just have title and price. So I'm going to say const items is equal to selected rate dot map. And here we're going to have the rate. And here we're going to have an object that's going to be structured exactly like this. So we're going to have name, which will be the rate dot title. We're going to have the price, which is going to be the rate dot price. And we are going to have quantity, which for now will be 1. Okay. And essentially, this selected rate, I know it's only one item. So technically, we could have just switched this out for this information. That would have been the same. But essentially here, what I'm doing is I'm teaching you how to deal with a situation where you might have several products selected. So if you're selecting several products, then eventually you're going to have to map them like this so that they can be used here in the items part of the create payment. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take this items and I'm going to switch it out just for the word items, which essentially will be this. So it'll be an array because selected rate is within an array, and there will be an array of objects. It might be one object, it might be several objects, and that will be our items. For the amount, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a function called reduce. I'm going to say const amount equals to items dot reduce. And here, the reduce is always a kind of complicated method. Whoops, here we need A and B. And what it does is basically it executes some kind of calculation on an array. So A would be a certain item and B would be the following item. So the calculation that we want to do is A dot A plus B dot price times B dot quantity. Okay, and then here at the very end, I'm going to add a 0. And what that indicates is that this reduce function starts with a value of 0. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and pass this amount over here into the create payment function. So I'm just going to pass this amount. And now we can go ahead and test out the code that we wrote. So I'm going to go over here and click play. And I am going to run this with a rate of small. If you don't see this rate over here, then just make sure to click the reset parameters refresh button, and then this rate should appear, and you just write small. Then I'm going to go ahead and click run. And I am getting a error because the amount was 0. Okay, so that means we have some kind of issue with our code, either with the amount or with the original items that the amount is based off of. So what I'm going to do is I am going to return over here, under the amount. I am going to return an object which has the items and the amount. And then I am going to go back to create my payment and run that again. And I see here that items doesn't have anything in it and amount has 0. So let's check. And we know this query should be working because this is the exact same query that we used on the front end. So our issue is probably here with the filter. And if I take a look, then I can see that I'm saying here that rate.title should be equal to rate. So what I think is what's happening here is that this rate is getting a little confused because we have rate up here and we have rate over here, and it's using this rate instead of this rate. So our filter is coming back empty. And what I'm going to do just to solve this naming issue is to change this rate just to an R, and over here just to an R as well. And then if I go to create payment and I run that, then we get back the item. Okay, so item small price 3, and we can see that the amount is also correct because it gave us a total of 3. And now we can get rid of this return over here and just make sure that the payment part is working as well. So I'm going to get rid of that and run. And we see that it got returned with a payment. So I'm actually curious, if you don't mind letting me know in the comments, do you enjoy when there are bugs and debugging throughout these tutorials, or would you prefer it be all clean code that's 100% working? I know that when I'm watching tutorials about coding and stuff like that, I like to see mistakes being made and then fixed, and I learn a lot from that, but I'm curious about how you feel about that. So that's pretty much our pre-selected amounts. And I just want to stress here why we did it this way. It's because the user now has no control over the price. Okay, they select a button and all the pricing information is taken from a database, and it prevents tampering. Okay, so in any situation, again, this is a tip calculator, so we appreciate any tip that comes, even if the person tampers with the tip. But you can understand that there are more sensitive situations for other goods and services where you don't want the person tampering with anything. And that's why we want to get all the information about the products once they're selected from the back end. The next thing that I want to implement is our custom amount. So this is a situation that we're going to be letting the user decide the amount that they want to tip. And in this situation, we are indeed going to pass the price information from the front end because, again, if the person is setting the custom amount, they probably won't go and tamper with that information later on because it's their choice to begin with. So what I'm going to do is declare another variable up here. Now I'm back on the front end code, and I'm going to say let custom amount. And then I'm going to add an event listener to our custom tip input, custom tip input dot on click. Sorry, this will be on change. And then I will say that custom amount will be equal to the value of our custom tip input dot value. And then when we are using our buy now button, I'm going to add a condition. But first, I want to make sure that it's connected. So this now is called tip now button. So I'm just going to change buy now to tip now. And this is, again, this is what I demonstrated in the previous tutorial. And this is essentially taking the create payment from the back end and then actually creating, starting and initiating the payment sequence on the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these consoles for now. And I'm going to add in condition and pass in, well, actually, I don't need a condition here, to be honest. I can just pass in here custom tip amount. Okay, and now in the back end, go to the back end, and here we're also going to receive a custom tip amount, which again, this custom tip amount, it could be undefined. So if the person doesn't decide to put any custom amount, then it'll start off undefined. It might be 0. So what I'm going to say that if this custom tip amount is bigger than 0, then what we're going to do, so I'm going to say here all the way on the top, if custom tip amount is bigger than 0, then items will be equal to name custom tip price custom tip amount and quantity 1, and our amount will be equal to custom tip amount, okay, because there's only ever going to be one item here. And if you had multiple inputs where people can input multiple amounts, then you might need something more complex than this. But for our purposes, this is good enough. I'm just going to have to hoist items. So I'm going to say let items, and I'm going to have to hoist amount as well. And that's because we're using it both here and here. Okay, and I want this variable to be available to us from the very beginning. And then I am going to add an else statement here, where we're only going to run all of this if there is no custom tip amount. So our assumption will be that if the person enters a custom tip amount, that's the amount they want to tip, even if they may have selected a tip amount before that. Okay, so this is all set up. And now I am going to publish and check this out on the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and publish and head over to this page and refresh. I'm going to close the console for now. We'll hope we don't have any issues. So first of all, let's test out our UX that we designed here. So when I click to select that, okay, so it didn't really do the enable disable thing that I had hoped. Let's see if we're running any errors over here. Aha. So after doing some debugging and testing, I realized that here on the front end, we also had a namings convention issue, just like we had in the back end. And I had been using this rate interchangeably. So rate was over here, and we were also using rate over here inside of the callback functions. So what I did is I basically reduced these all just to an R as the variable. In general, I don't recommend using single letter variables. In callback functions, it can be slightly more acceptable, but if I was refactoring this code later on, not during a tutorial, I would probably choose longer and more significant names for all of these things. But for now, that will do the trick. As I was debugging, I just want to point out that I also noticed another issue, which was that up here, I had called the variable custom amount. And then down here in the other functions, it was either custom amount or custom tip amount. So I just made sure that all those variables were lined up so that the code would actually work. So now I'm going to go ahead and publish the code with all these fixes and head to the front end. And over here, I am going to go to the site with the widget. I'm going to refresh. You can still see some of the remnants of my tests from earlier over here. And let's just demonstrate the working version now. So if I go ahead and I click one of these buttons and then click Tip Now, then the payments module will open up and display the tip. So you can see here it's a $6 tip, and it just says here medium. Maybe in production I would change this to be something like medium tip, or maybe use some wording that's a little more kind of friendly in terms of making the person feel good that they're tipping. And here for the custom amount, for example, if I put in $20 and I click tip now, then you can see that the payments module comes up with a $20 tip. And here it says custom tip because that's what we set at the back end. The next thing that I want to show is if you see here that we have some details from the user, and here they're being asked to add the details here in a form, but I actually want to send these details in from the front end of the website because I think that that's a better experience, or maybe I have these details in advance. Basically, I'm doing this just to demonstrate how it's done, not because it specifically has a use case here in my tip calculator. So what I've done is I've set up these three inputs, and we're going to be using that to transfer that info to the actual payments modal. So let's go back to our website. And we are going to start on the front end by collecting the user information when we click the Tip Now button. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a new object, and it's going to be called user info. And there are 5 points of data that can be collected and passed here to the modal. That's the first name, last name, email, country, and phone number. I'm going to be focusing just on first name, last name, and email. And we're going to be collecting it from these inputs over here, which I've named first name input, last name input, email input. And I just need to assign those values over here. So here we have first name input, and here we're going to have, sorry, I do want that, last name input, and these are obviously dot value, okay, because we're going to be getting the value of those inputs. And last but not least, email, input dot value. Great. Now that we have that user info, what we're going to need to do is to pass that information to the backend. I'm just going to add a little note here that if you check out the documentation, so you'll see that also in create payment, we have the user info, which is the backend function. And also in the front end documentation, there still is a mention of user info within the options over here. But if you take a deeper look, you'll see that it's depreciated. Okay, so that means it doesn't work, or it won't work at some time in the future, or they're not working on this feature anymore. So you should be passing it from the backend instead. So I'm going to go over here to the site and pass this information to our create my payment function, which is working on the backend. So I'm going to pass here user info. And then on the back end, I'm going to add that user info here as a parameter and add the user info right here after the amount as it is stated in the documentation. And now if I publish the site, and head to our live site, don't forget to refresh so that you're working with the newest version of your website. And once that comes up, what we can do is just run a test using the first name, last name, and email. I go ahead and use Bob Vance at gmail.com. Select a tip and click tip now. And now the modal opens, and you can see here that the email, the first name, and last name are already pre-populated. Again, in my current tip calculator, it's not a huge difference if the user needs to put in their info here or after they click tip now. But in other situations where you collect user information at a different point during your website and you store that information, then you can actually use that in the backend to populate that information and save them some time. I just did it here for the sake of demonstration. The last thing that I want to do is do some error handling and record the. So I'm back here on the front end code of our website. And for the error handling, I'm going to be doing two things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a try catch because we're using async await over here. So I'm going to be adding a try catch, and I'm going to be putting these two lines of code inside of the try. And then if we have an error, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to say console.log error. And I'm also going to show our error message. Show. Okay, and our error message at the moment is quite generic. So if you want to create different messages for different situations, you're going to have to dive a little deeper into what different error messages we might get and create specific error messages for each one. At the moment, I'm just going with a generic one to give a general demonstration of how to do this. The second thing we're going to do is, depending on the result, we will either show an error or a success message. And if you take a look again at the documentation, you'll see that when we get back our promise from the start payment function, we get the payment information, but we also get a status. And that's what I'm going to be using. And basically, I'm going to tell the code that if it's anything but successful, then we should say that there was an error. And otherwise, we are going to say that it was successful. Obviously, there are a lot of different situations here, and you might want to handle each one differently. Pending is not necessarily an error, but this is just a very simple demonstration. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say if result dot status equals successful. Make sure that I spelled that correctly, because I'm notoriously bad at spelling. And then we will display our success message. Dot show, sorry, not display. And else we will show our error message. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do is just whenever we click on the Tip Now button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide our error message. So that they can see if that transaction actually had an error or it was something else. Okay, because otherwise the messages will just stay there no matter what. So let's publish this and do a short demonstration. So I'm going to head back to the site. I'm going to hit refresh. And I'm going to demonstrate two different error situations. So the first one will be that I'm going to try and tip without actually selecting an amount. So you can see here there was an error, please try again. And then if I go ahead and I select an amount and I click Tip Now, then the error, the model does come up and it works. I saw that the error message did not disappear, so maybe I had some kind of mistake there. But in general, the error message did come up when we had an error, and it then the modal did work later on when it was working. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so this should be hide, not show. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and publish again. I'm going to hit refresh. And hit Tip Now. We got an error message. And I'm going to select another button and click Tip Now. You see it disappeared and our modal came up. So that's all working as expected. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to cancel this payment. So I'm not going to go through with the payment. I'm going to go here and I'm going to click X here on top. And you can see now that we don't have a success message, but I was expecting an error message over here. Let's take a look at that. And here I forgot to write .show. That would explain why that's not working. So I'm going to go ahead and click publish. And it's early morning here for those of you who are wondering. So yeah. But that's life, you know, when you're coding, that's going to happen all the time. You're going to miss something and you have to go back and fix it. And that's why we do testing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select one, Tip Now, and we enter the modal, and I'm going to exit the modal, and you can see that we get an error message, okay, indicating that our payment did not go through. Okay, so that's a little bit about error handling, and now I want to move on to the last point, which will be making a record of the transaction. So for this last part, I went ahead and I created a collection that I called tips. And I'm going to go here and open the collection just so you can see it. And basically it keeps a record of the basic information regarding the tip that I received. So we have here email, first name, last name, amount. And if I zoom out a little bit, then you'll be able to see also the payment ID and the status. And all of the updating of this stuff is going to happen in the back end, okay? Because we don't want anybody tampering with any of this information. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go to the backend file that we set up, the module, and zoom right back in. And what we're going to do here is that once we run this create my payment function, what we're going to do is we are going to insert an item into that collection. But before we do that, we need to do a little refactoring because we are going to need to access the payment in the backend. At the moment, we're only accessing the payment in the front end, but we want to access it in the backend. So what we're going to need to do is change this from return to const payment equals await Wix-Pay. And then we're going to be returning this payment. But we can actually do other things with the payment now before we return it. And that thing that we're going to be doing is inserting an item to the tips collection. So what I'm going to be doing is new tip item is going to be equal to Wix data. Don't forget an await here. Dot insert. And this is going to be the tips collection. And we're going to be inserting an item which is made up of a few things. So let's define that over here. This is going to be our new tip item. And this is going to be an object. And we are going to have, So I'm going to change the name of this tip item to insert. And this is going to be equal to, first I'm going to spread in the user info. Okay, so that's going to be the first name, last name, and email. And then I'm going to put in the amount. And I'm going to put in the payment ID, which is payment.id. And then this is the item that we're going to insert over here. So I'm going to put here tip item to insert. And I'm going to add an option of suppress auth. And that basically means that we'll be able to insert it no matter what the permissions are on the collection, because in general, the collection will be set to only an admin can add stuff to there, because we don't want people to add information. We have no need for users to be able to add information to that. So that should add our initial tip item. And now what we need to do is we need to keep track of the status. And in order to do that, we are going to be using events. You may be familiar with events from the front end, where we can listen for things like a user clicking or their mouse moving over a certain place. And in a similar way, we can also listen for events in the back end. So this is the example of a back-end quote-unquote event listener. And this is something that Wix has set up for us to run certain actions when a certain event takes place. And many of the Wix APIs have this kind of functionality. And we have one for the Pay API as well. And this basically allows us to get information on a payment when it's updated. And in order to implement this, I'm just going to copy over the code over here. And we need to put this, as it says, in a events.js file in the site's backend section. So I'm going to head over to our site and head over to the backend. And if you click the plus button over here, you'll see you have the option to add a special JS file, which is for handling backend events. And once you add that, you'll see you have a events.js added in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the code from the Velo reference right over here. So this is a function that's going to run whenever we make an update to a payment. And you can see here that it has an event, and by tapping into different properties of this event, we can get information. So we can get, for example, what they have here is the payment ID and the new transaction status, which are actually the two things that we're going to be needing for our purposes. So what we're going to be doing is that once we get this payment ID, we are going to want to query our tips collection and see if we have a tip with this payment ID. And if we do, then we are going to update it with this new status. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to import the Wix data API. Let's import that Wix data from Wix data. And I'm also going to make this an async function. So we can query a data set in here. And I'm going to say const, let's make this a little smaller so we can see, const tips query result will be equal to await Wix data dot query tips, that was the name of the collection, dot equals payment ID, and don't forget find at the end. Okay, so this should find us that one result where our tip is using this payment ID. And let's just add an if statement here that if the tips query result dot items dot length is bigger than 0, we are going to update that item in the collection. So let's say that our item to update will be equal to tip query result dot items 0, because we're only really expecting to get back one item here. And our item to update, this should go under the status that we have here. Our item to update dot status should be equal to the new transaction status. And last but not least, we can say that const updated item is equal to await Wix data dot update tips collection, and we're going to pass in our item to update over here. Don't forget to here as well add the suppress auth option, because only the admin has the option to update on this collection. We want to make sure that we don't run into any problems over there. And for just good measure, we can console our updated item. The thing is that with this event, unfortunately, when I was running some tests, I noticed that it doesn't work for payment cancellations. It only works if you actually go through and have a successful payment, which means that you will actually need to make a small payment through your website in order to check this out. It's not a huge deal because the payment is going to you, but you still want to make a payment that's as small as possible because there are some fees involved with collecting payments on your website, and it is a small waste of money to do this, so try and keep it to a minimum. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to publish this newest update. And first, I'm going to run a test with a canceled payment. So I'm going to go ahead over here, and I'm going to select a payment amount, and I'm going to click Tip Now. We enter this payment modal, and I'm going to cancel the payment. And if we go over here to the editor and check out the tips collection, we should see that we have all the information except for the status. And I don't see that we have the information over here now. Let's see. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, so we do have it. It's just I didn't put in my email, first name, last name over here when I was just running the test. So that was empty, but we do have the amount and we do have a payment ID. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run another test and make another payment, but I'm actually going to go through with the payment this time. So let me go ahead and do that, and then I'll be back in one moment.